Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I have the honor to welcome lots of groups here. And in this hallowed space, we have to be scrupulously nonpartisan because the Constitution Center has an inspiring charter from Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis, to be the only place in the country that brings together people of different perspectives, libertarians, liberals, conservatives, to converge around, debate, and educate ourselves about this great document of human freedom that unites us, the U.S. Constitution. But despite this obligation to be nonpartisan, I am able to tell you, sincerely and wholeheartedly, that I view you, each of you who've chosen to come to FIRE's conference, and I view Greg and FIRE as heroes of the Constitution. You are defending a First Amendment tradition, which is the core of who we are as Americans. This tradition was hard fought. It was articulated by Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. It was defended by abolitionists during the Civil War who repudiated Southern mobs that were trying to deny the free speech rights of African Americans. It was codified and expressed more beautifully and precisely than ever before in the incredible work of Justice Louis Brandeis that I want to talk to you about tonight. And it was finally recognized by an increasingly unanimous Supreme Court in a series of heroic decisions defending hate speech and based on the principle that speech in America can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That is how profoundly and clearly and unequivocally the U.S. Constitution protects free speech. That principle distinguishes us from every other Western democracy. Go around Europe, look at France, look at the European Union, you will see a far different balance and efforts to regulate speech in the name not of liberty, but of equality or dignity or other important values, but values that the U.S. Constitution believes must bow before the importance of free speech. And this principle is increasingly under fire in America today. You know, because you are at the front lines of this battle, how difficult it is to defend this heroic tradition which so many people have fought and died for. And you are doing it, and that takes courage. And I'm so pleased and personally proud to be able to just tell you what I think tonight, because as the head of the Constitution Center, all I can do is describe arguments on both sides. And when there are hard contested questions, I have to tell people what they are. But this is not a close question. This is a question where liberals and conservatives, justices of all stripes, have unanimously converged around this beautiful constitutional principle that you are defending, but that many in America are falling short of. So what I want to do during my brief time tonight is most of all thank you for what you're doing. I gather that many of you found about this conference online, that FIRE does not have student chapters, but you care so much about free speech that you took the time to find out about the leading organization that is defending free speech on campus and came here today. That is an impressive achievement. And I just want to, as intensely and concisely as possible, tell you why it is that you can be confident that the principle that you're defending is rooted entirely in the most nonpartisan vision of the U.S. Constitution, how it applies on campuses today, and how it might apply online. All right, I'll try to do that really concisely and not be a law professor and go on too long. I can be confident that this is a nonpartisan tradition because of this incredible new app that the Constitution Center has launched and which you can find in your iPhones and online at constitutioncenter.org. I want you to download this amazing app, not now because I'm talking and you have to look at what I'm saying, but after the show. It's called the Interactive Constitution, and it's in the App Store and it's also on the web. And this amazing tool has gotten 10 million hits since it launched just a year ago. And the College Board has adopted it as the centerpiece of the new AP History and Government exams. And it's co-sponsored by the American Constitution Society, one of the leading progressive lawyers' organizations in America, and the Federalist Society, the leading conservative and libertarian lawyers' organization in America. And these two great organizations have come together under the rubric of the National Constitution Center and nominated scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So how exciting it is to be able to look at each of the 27 amendments, or altogether 80 clauses of the Constitution, click on each of them, and see what the leading liberal and conservative scholars agree and disagree about. So we're going to start right with the First Amendment, and we're going to click on it, and we see all of its clauses, and we'll go right to the free speech clause, and we'll find Jeff Stone and Eugene Volokh. Jeffrey Stone, first of all, I want to have another round of applause for our incredible student winners, including from the University of Chicago. Thank you for that amazing work. And you have had the privilege of working with Jeff Stone, and Chicago has done such inspiring work in articulating principles of free speech on campus. And Jeff Stone is nominated by ACS, and Eugene Volokh is nominated by FedSoc. And you click on their common explainer, and you see this statement, and you know that every single word in this statement, agreed to by Stone and Volokh, is agreed to by the leading liberal and libertarian free speech scholars in America. So you can know it's true, and if your friends tell you it's not, show them the interactive Constitution. And you'll see that the First Amendment has been interpreted very broadly. Generally speaking, it means that government may not jail, fine, or impose civil liability on people or organizations based on what they say or write, except in exceptional circumstances. And you'll learn here quickly what the circumstances are: defamation, true threats, fighting words, obscenity, child pornography, commercial advertising. That does not include hate speech. Even entertainment, vulgarity, hate speech, blasphemy, and violent video games are protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has been reluctant to expand this list of low-value categories of speech, and that is because Stone and Volokh tell us the Supreme Court has said, and our founders believed, at least Jefferson and Madison believed, that speech could only be banned if it was intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. So that's what the Constitution says, and that's what both sides agree to, and that's what the Supreme Court has said. And if your colleagues or friends or fellow citizens say that it's a hard question about whether hate speech can be banned, you can say, no, it's not a hard question. This is something about which both sides on the Supreme Court and in the Academy agree. So the interactive Constitution is a great resource. But you need to do more than just cite Supreme Court case law. You need to give your friends an argument for the value of free speech. And I know you all appreciate that argument because that's what made you come here tonight. But I believe, for me, I am most inspired, and when I try to teach people or learn with them about why free speech is important, I tell them the story of Louis Brandeis. So that's what I want to do now. And Brandeis is so galvanizing and important because he's the most important prophet both of free speech and privacy of the 20th century, and because he changes his mind about the appropriate balance between dignity and free speech, which is really the central question that you're debating on campuses today. Initially, in the most famous article on the right to privacy ever written, in 1890, Brandeis favors dignity over free expression. The question then is whether a new technology, the Kodak camera and the tabloid press, which are writing gossip columns about celebrities, can be restricted. And Brandeis and his law partner, Charles Warren, believe that the dignity of celebrities who are being written about by the Boston tabloids should be able to be regulated in the name of privacy. Basically, they're writing about the equivalent of the Hulk Hogan case of its day. The question is whether truthful but embarrassing stuff about celebrities can be suppressed. But Brandeis looks through American law and he finds that unlike European law, our law contains no remedy for offenses against honor or dignity. Instead, we've focused more on liberty. So he proposes a series of new causes of action. They're called the Brandeis torts. They sound like a delicious dessert, but they're in fact an unsatisfactory and elusive series of legal causes of action that allow people to sue for intentional infliction of emotional distress, intrusion on seclusion, or any speech that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person. And in the name of these Brandeis torts, celebrities try to suppress truthful and embarrassing information from the newspapers. Soon after he writes the article, Brandeis changes his mind. He writes to his wife and says, I reread the privacy article. It's not as good as I thought it was. Brandeis comes to understand that judges should not be given the power to decide what the balance between dignity and free speech is and what kind of speech people should be interested in. Instead, in a free society, that's a decision that people have to make for themselves. And he expresses his new understanding of free speech in the most beautiful and important free speech opinion of the 20th century, Whitney versus California. I'm a law professor, as Greg said, so that's my homework to you. If you haven't read it already, read and be inspired by Brandeis's beautiful concurrence in Whitney. And Whitney is a case, it's 1927, and there are all of these convictions for people who criticize World War I. And the illiberal Espionage Act of 1917, which is being invoked in part again today for the possible prosecution of journalists, is used to imprison a series of critics of World War I, including Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate for president in 1920, who runs for president in 1920 from a jail cell because the Supreme Court has upheld his conviction for making a mild speech criticizing World War I. And the speech is upheld, the suppression is upheld on the grounds that any speech that might have a bad tendency to encourage lawless action or disrespect for public order can be suppressed. That's an argument that you hear on campus today, that it might lead people to have disrespect for the law. Brandeis initially joins these decisions along with Oliver Wendell Holmes, but over the summer of 1919, he changes his mind and comes to believe that only speech that's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence can be suppressed. He changes his mind because he reads an article by Zechariah Chafee about free speech in wartime, and because he rereads Jefferson. Over the summer of 1926, he reads Jefferson's first inaugural, where Jefferson, who believes that we have certain natural rights that come from God or nature and not government, and the preeminent natural right is the right of complete freedom of conscience and opinion. And Jefferson believes this because he believes we all have certain faculties, from passion at the bottom to reason at the top, and we have a duty to educate ourselves so that we can cultivate our faculties of reason. And we can no more alienate or surrender our freedom of conscience to government when we move from the state of nature to civil society than we can alienate our reason itself. As creatures of reason, as creatures of the Enlightenment, reason is fundamental to who we are. So it's this profound faith in reason that leads Jefferson in his first inaugural to say we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists, but we can converge around the Constitution. It's what leads him to quote in a letter that Brandeis cites to the Connecticut preacher Elijah Boardman to talk about the importance of complete freedom of thought and opinion. And it's what leads Brandeis to emphasize the importance of public deliberation and reason in his Whitney concurrence. Brandeis has one other great influence, and that is 5th century Athens. One of his favorite books is called The Greek Polis, written by Alfred Zimmern. And in the agora, where citizens would come together to deliberate face to face and to reason together, Brandeis came to see the apotheosis of the thoughtful deliberation that he thought was necessary for democracy to succeed. So he channels Jefferson and he channels Pericles in this incredible Whitney concurrence. And as a party trick, I'm going to recite it to you now, and I know I can do it because I just did it on the Fire podcast, and we got through it, and we had such a great conversation, and that was so much totally fun. So here I'm going to channel Brandeis on Whitney. So listen just to his beautiful language, and every word is really important. So here we go, and what's important is that he starts by referring not to Madison and Hamilton and the Constitution makers of 1787 who met in Independence Hall, right over there, but to Jefferson and the revolutionaries of 1776. Here is Brandeis and Whitney. Those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. That's the quotation from Pericles' funeral oration. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest threat to freedom is in inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. That is what you need to share with your skeptical friends or those who are questioning the value of open debate or who believe that the proper response to hate speech is suppression rather than, as Brandeis believed, counter-speech. It's this profound faith in public deliberation and also this belief in the public duty of people to educate themselves with the best and worst arguments on all sides that Brandeis says, as long as there's time enough to deliberate, then the best response to evils counsels as good ones. Now, there's a profound and important question today about whether there's still time enough to deliberate. And with new technologies that have so speeded up the pace of our public deliberations, leading to Twitter mobs and to filter bubbles and echo chambers and people insulating themselves into self-reinforcing pods and speech moving at warp speed, this notion of thoughtful deliberation in the Athenian agora seems like a romantic ideal. And yet, we must maintain the faith that it is possible, and you must continue to fight on campus to ensure that speech is not suppressed in the name of dignity because you have to insist instead on public deliberation. So I just think and want to tell you, as the head of the National Constitution Center, that the question of whether hate speech on campus is protected is not a close question. There is a question about whether private universities are formally bound by the First Amendment, but with that technicality aside, all public universities and the many private universities that have held themselves to be morally bound by the First Amendment may not suppress speech because it causes emotional distress in the name of dignity. It must be protected unless it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. Greg was mentioning today an article in the New York Times by a psychologist trying to redefine the notion of violence and claim that any speech that causes emotional injury is a form of violence. That's the move that Brandeis had flirted with and then rejected. Emotional injury is not violence. Emotional injury is emotional injury. It's a dignitary offense. It is not a form of incitement. There are also efforts to redefine the notion of imminence and the mere possibility that in the future speech might cause a violent result is used to invoke it. That is the heckler's veto, and that too may not be allowed. So I just want you to leave tonight emboldened and resolute and determined to continue to maintain this bipartisan, unanimous tradition because its answers to the speech on campus question are so clear. The final question I want to just touch on is a really hard and fascinating one, and we need to think through it together, and that's what to do about speech online. Speech not on campuses, many of which are bound by the First Amendment, but speech on Google and Facebook and Twitter and all the platforms where we live and debate, platforms whose deciders, the lawyers that run Facebook and Google and Twitter, have more power over who can speak and who can be heard than any king or president or Supreme Court justice. And I can cite the interactive Constitution and tell you about the American free speech tradition as interpreted by the Supreme Court, but that may not matter to Google and Facebook because the Constitution says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't say Mark Zuckerberg shall make no law, or Google shall make no law. And the platforms, since they're not the government, are not bound by the First Amendment, and yet they control the form of our speech. It is also an anxious time for the platforms. In some ways, the free speech platforms are defending the American First Amendment tradition against pressures from Europe to suppress it. The most dramatic clash between the American and European visions of free speech comes from a new decision by the European Court of Justice involving a new right called the right to be forgotten on the internet. This comes from the French droit à l'oubli, or the right of oblivion, which is incredibly French, straight out of Sartre. I want to be forgotten, the French say, whereas Americans want to be remembered. But this is not a light matter because according to this ruling, If we were in Europe right now and someone were tweeting, Jeff is going on a little long, I hoped he would just talk about campus speech, but now he's going to go on the internet, it's another 10 minutes, gosh, I want dessert. After the speech, I could object that this scurrilous and embarrassing, if perhaps true, tweet violated my dignity, and I could demand that it be removed or de-indexed by Google or Yahoo or any search engine. And then Google would have to make an initial decision about whether I'm a public figure and whether your tweet is in the public interest. And if they guess wrong, then they're liable for up to 2% of their annual income, which in Google's case last year was $60 billion. So the prospect of a $12 million fine per incident tends to concentrate the mind. And as a result, Google has removed 43% of the takedown requests it's received in Europe for truthful and embarrassing speech, including speech about the right to be forgotten itself. So this just shows so dramatically how the Europeans will suppress speech in the name of dignity. We strike a different balance. You can debate which tradition you prefer, and if you're in Europe, then it's fine to try to privilege dignity over privacy, but the platforms are really in a bind. So France has now demanding that Google take down speech that violates the right to be forgotten in France, not only on Google.fr, which is the French search engine, but across the world. And Google doesn't want to do that, so it faces a tough choice. It can defy France and face those huge fines. It can move out of France, which it doesn't want to do, or it can create two search engines, one for Google.com and one for Google.Europe, and it may choose that second option if this global takedown request continues. So in that case, Google is trying to enforce the American tradition as much as it can. More generally, however, Google and Facebook do not entirely embrace the American First Amendment tradition. Their terms of service allow the regulation of hate speech. And they define hate speech in rather idiosyncratic ways. So I got to talk to these guys a few years ago for a piece I was writing and learned that the Facebook terms of service were written by a very thoughtful young man who was about 27 years old. He just graduated from Bowdoin, and he'd read John Stuart Mill in college. So he decided that Facebook would allow the criticism of religious leaders, but not of religions. So you can't say on Facebook, I hate the Prophet Muhammad. You can't say I hate Muslims, but you can say I hate the Prophet Muhammad. And that was because this 27-year-old guy who'd worked in the help desk was quickly promoted to be head of Facebook's hate speech policies and just came up with this distinction. As it happens, Google, following Facebook, adopted the same distinction based on this guy's John Stuart Mill college readings. And as a result, a few years ago, when it came down to claims by President Obama and the president of Egypt to remove the Innocence of the Muslims video, which was this crude morality play which criticized the prophet in very wooden terms, YouTube, owned by Google, and Facebook said no, because they looked at their terms of service and said this video is criticizing the Prophet Muhammad but is not criticizing Muslims. It doesn't violate our terms of service. Therefore, we're going to leave up the video. I think that was a good decision, especially in the face of claims that later debunked the argument that this video was causing the Benghazi riots. The video had been up for months before the Benghazi riots, which appear to have been caused by other reasons. So there's a case where the president of the United States and the president of Egypt are saying to the search engines, take down the video, and they look at their terms of service and they say no. A great result for the First Amendment. But ladies and gentlemen, what is it like to live in a world where the lines about who can speak and who can be heard are written by this very well-intentioned and thoughtful, but rather idiosyncratic young college graduate who drew a line which is rooted not in First Amendment jurisprudence or even in any particular logic, but just in a kind of line that he drew? And what can we do about a world where the decisions about what to take down and what to leave up are being made by lawyers, often right out of law school, many of them wearing flip-flops and t-shirts and working in San Bernardino County out of those pods that everyone works out of today. And these people are performing the role of Supreme Court justices, and they're doing the best they can, but they're applying terms of services that are idiosyncratic, to say the least. I do not have an answer to what strikes me as one of the most urgent and hard questions of free speech in the 21st century, namely, how shall we write the rules, and who shall oversee the deciders at a time when the search engines themselves are striking their own balance between free speech and privacy? I know we need a vigorous debate about it, but I very much believe this. What you are doing is really important. when it comes to striking a good balance. Ultimately, these lawyers are, some of them went to law school, they may have read Louis Brandeis, they have vague efforts to defend the First Amendment, but they're ultimately subject to consumer pressures. They're running for-profit corporations. And as you well know from your experience on campuses, there is not a big market for the free speech tradition. It's not a popular tradition, and all the consumer pressures are on the other side. But Brandeis believed there's a distinction between consumers and citizens. He had a horror of the idea of the commodified citizen who would view everything in terms of its economic value, and he believed that there are certain civic values, like free expression, that should transcend the values of the marketplace. So what I want you to do, in addition to your incredibly important work defending free speech on campus, is contribute to the debate in a way that will embolden and support the Google and Facebook and Twitter deciders and allow them to resist these consumer pressures as much as possible and draw the lines in good places rather than bad lines. I want you to pay attention to this debate, and as the terms of service change, argue for the most speech protective boundaries. And this is a debate that has to take place at all levels of government, at state legislatures, in Congress, in regulatory agencies, and ultimately in the companies themselves. And that is, I'll just end by saying thank you. There are few times in a young person's life where you can really show courage. And from what I gather is going on campuses today, it does take some courage to be standing up for the positions that you're standing up for. You're doing so in the face of great public disapproval. All of the social pressures are on the other side. And you're doing that because you are very attached to these principles of freedom and expression, and you believe that they're important and worth defending even at the cost of personal disadvantage. That bravery is noble. It will make a difference. It will ensure the survival of this beautiful, important American constitutional tradition that people have fought and died for. And I want you now to continue to take it online and help us strike a good balance for privacy and free speech in the 21st century. And I'd be happy if we have time to have a conversation. So thank you so much. Great. I'd really love to learn from you about what's going on, especially on problems you're facing on campuses today. Yeah.
Thank you. I know a lot of the discussion right now surrounding corporations and the speech on the internet is centering around this idea of the government maintaining net neutrality rules and the FCC maintaining regulation authority over speech as opposed to corporations, and where that power should reside. I'm wondering what you think about that balance, and whether the FCC maintaining control over that is even sustainable, whether maybe there's room for a constitutional amendment additionally to protect speech on the internet potentially, or whether it should go to the corporations. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Great question. Is net neutrality the answer to free speech in an age when the corporate platforms control it? So just to remind ourselves, net neutrality says that a media corporation or any corporation has to treat all platforms equally and can't suppress or degrade one speech platform over another. So the paradigmatic example was Comcast, and the claim was that it was favoring its own file sharing services over Napster. So someone who tried to share a version of the King James Bible or a barbershop quartet video over Napster had it slowed down, whereas the Comcast file server went fast. And the fear is that as big media corporations merge, like the latest proposal is Time Warner and AT&T, then a giant merged corporation might favor its own platforms over that of its competitors, and that could have effects on free speech. The truth is, so far, examples of direct free speech suppression by the platforms have been relatively isolated. There was an attempt by one of the platforms to ban pro-life speech during the Super Bowl, and they withdrew in the face of protest. It's more now a fear than a example that's led to direct free speech suppression, but it's a legitimate one. And in the spirit, whenever I have a hard question, as you can imagine, I ask WWBD, what would Brandeis do? So Brandeis definitely would have been concerned about the question that you pose, how to regulate giant corporations when media giants have such power over speech. So do I think net neutrality is important? I think that it is, and the arguments against it don't seem to me persuasive. They seem mostly based on the idea of trust us, we won't favor our own competitors, and therefore I would like to see it go through. But you raised the more profound question, is net neutrality enough to protect free speech in the age of media consolidation? And I think it's not. Alternatives are antitrust law. So that's something that free speech lawyers don't tend to think a lot about, but it was central to the debate about monopoly power in the election of 1912, which Brandeis was part of. So in the election of 1912, all three candidates want to break up corporate power, but for different reasons. Brandeis and Woodrow Wilson want to break up the giant corporations so that they can't threaten liberty. Theodore Roosevelt, channeling the new nationalism, wants to create huge oversight bodies to oversee the huge corporations, a solution that the Jeffersonian Brandeis and Wilson don't like because they don't like big government any more than big business. And the third candidate, William Howard Taft, wants vigorous antitrust prosecutions and brings more antitrust prosecutions in a single term than Roosevelt did in two. Taft is my new hero. My next book is on that forgotten constitutional hero, William Howard Taft, our most judicial president and presidential chief justice who viewed every decision as president in constitutional terms. But I mention this just to suggest what an amazing world it was where the Democrat and both the progressive and the Republican candidates all are alert to the effects on liberty of monopoly power and favor different versions of antitrust enforcement or disaggregating the corporations or regulations to protect them. But you raised the most profound question of all, do we need maybe a constitutional amendment to regulate Google and Facebook? And in a formal sense, obviously we would need one because Google and Facebook are not bound by the First Amendment. Here, though, libertarians in particular, civil libertarian liberals and libertarian conservatives, may disagree. Libertarian conservatives who tend to mistrust government power sometimes lack a similar suspicion of concentrated corporate power, and civil libertarian liberals who don't like big corporations sometimes lack a similar suspicion of big government. Brandeis didn't like either of them. He doesn't like bigness in business or government, so I know he would have, the idea of breaking up Google might have appealed to him, antitrust prosecutions, but whether a constitutional amendment to regulate Google for Brandeis, I think, is a hard question. He did endorse, as Jefferson did, a constitutional amendment that would have forbade Congress from setting up corporations with exclusive privileges or monopolies. That was one of the Jeffersonian proposals that didn't go through. So it shouldn't be off the table, but I think that question you ask is the hard central one, and although you can take different positions on it, viewing Google and Facebook's free speech policies as one that has constitutional dimensions is really important.
Hi, thank you again for speaking to us. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
My question is, I go to a private university, and I mean, our speech codes are relatively they protect the First Amendment in that way, but what incentive, can we explain to administrators for these rights, right? Because they are private institutions, and a lot of the times they're worried about their reputations. So how can we explain to administrators and even to other students that, we should enjoy the same privileges in this space?
That's such a good question. Some private universities have said we have a moral duty to obey the First Amendment. Harvard in the 1970s said we're not technically bound by the First Amendment, but we are going to embrace it because it would be unthinkable for a university devoted to the free exchange of ideas not to protect as much free exchange of ideas as the First Amendment does. I am distressed to find out that Harvard may not be living up to those principles today, as our Harvard Award recipient shows, but at least morally, they thought it would be embarrassing not to embrace those principles. So I would start there just by saying how, yes, you can technically claim that the First Amendment doesn't bind you, but these principles are correct and true. And Brandeis was right, and the Supreme Court was right to say that hate speech should be met with counter speech. Do you university administrators disagree with that? Do you really believe that the free exchange of ideas will flourish rather than being inhibited by suppression and so forth? And I would just, I mean, you can tell, obviously, I care a lot about it, as I know you do, because you're here. So just have the debate. Although Greg and I were just talking, I said, I asked him, would it be helpful? Let me ask you the question I asked Greg. Would it be helpful for, say, the Constitution Center to sponsor debates on campus, like your campus, where we tried to say, should a private university be bound by the First Amendment? Yeah. And do you think we could get strong voices on both sides? That would be great.
I think there's division even within like political organizations. Like I'm a member of the Young Democrats, but like I feel like there's division even in that space as to whether hate speech should be protected in particular.
Yeah, that would be great. And different versions of it. Should hate speech be protected? Should private universities be bound? Is speech a form of violence? One thing I want you to know is that people around the country are really following what you're doing closely, and those, although it may not always be obvious on campus, there's grave concern on both sides, liberals, conservatives, civil libertarians, libertarian conservatives, about the future of free speech. So people want to support these principles and support these debates. So if we can help, maybe Greg and I will talk more, and we'll talk with you. And basically, here's an open invitation. If ever you think it would be helpful to have representatives from these national organizations like the Federalist Society and the Constitution Society come and talk about why these principles are important, we can maybe send a SWAT team in and parachute in. I really believe there are foundations that would like to support this, and I think we can do it. So Rosen at constitutioncenter.org, and you know where to find Greg, and together we could think about dispatching these SWAT teams in a way that would give you the support you need to fight the fight that you're fighting, because it's incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my question basically boils down to the argument many opponents make basically doubts the faculties of the American people. So they point to the fake news epidemic. They point to political science research about people's voting decisions and tribalism. So how do you affirmatively make the case when it seems like most Americans really don't pay a lot of attention to these issues, that we are thoroughly digesting these issues, and we are in control of our faculties, and we are capable of making the best decisions once we've been given the information?
That's such a good question, and such a hard and important question too. Because on the one hand, we know from the evidence that not all Americans are as engaged in constitutional education as the people in this room. The Annenberg Foundation recently found that only a third of Americans can name all three branches of government. A third can't name a single branch of government. And more Americans can name the 7 dwarves than the 9 justices and so forth. So the evidence of constitutional lack of literacy is rampant. And we also see the crude debates and embrace of filter bubbles and of demagogic positions. And we know that the founders were not idealists about unchecked democracy. Jefferson and Madison saw a tension between constitutionalism on the one hand and populism on the other. The founders studied failed democracies. They studied Greece and Rome, and they saw how unchecked democracy could degenerate into demagogues and the mob, just as unchecked aristocracy could degenerate into tyranny and oligarchy. So they wanted to check direct democracy and create filters that would provoke thoughtful deliberation. So you can tell me whether this is too wonky or too elitist, but this is what the framers believed, that the people, if summoned to their better natures, would be capable of deliberating in a thoughtful way, and their thoughtfully considered opinions could be channeled by representatives and enacted into law. So I think that's what my answer to you is, that Brandeis is not a romantic about unchecked democracy. He recognizes that some people would rather watch cat videos than read the ancient Greeks and educate themselves about the fundamental principles of democracy. But he has faith in education, and this is so important. You have to have it. All of you do. You're defined by it, and I do too. This is why I have such a meaningful job running, helping people educate themselves about the Constitution. Brandeis thinks that given time and opportunity, citizens can rise to the better angels of their nature and inform themselves about complicated ideas and ultimately contribute to thoughtful deliberation. So I think that's what we need to do, is not allow quick decisions and snap judgments, and Brexit could never have happened in America because we don't allow important constitutional decisions to be made by referendum. Snap votes are not the way that the American system makes fundamental, important questions involving our democracy. And similarly on campus, the question of whether to allow or suppress speech is not supposed to be made in quick polls or Twitter votes. So, this is a serious problem about how to fight the pressures toward instant decisions and ill-informed judgments, but we need to do it. The founders believed it was possible, and Brandeis had faith that it was possible too. Just the takeaway, just because your question is so important, what you tell those people is, yes, it's true that there's plenty of evidence of unreason, of fake news, of ill-informed votes. We need to create structures of deliberation that allow people to talk together thoughtfully, to hear the best arguments on both sides, to take time, and then to make up their own minds. Back there. So that's a long jog. Oh, great.
Thank you for speaking with us. I wanted to ask a little bit more about social media corporate control. So haven't companies always gotten, at least to some extent, to decide what messages are given a public platform? So for instance, a news outlet has kind of always been able to decide what op-eds they run or who's allowed to speak on a political program. So it's always been that way, and like Facebook can't stop me from making a blog and promoting it, or standing on a street corner handing out flyers or speaking my mind. So I guess to some extent I'm just failing to see how this is any different or worse than it has been in the past.
Great question. So every age has had a technology for speech dissemination. So at the founding, it was the printing press, and I don't know if they're open now. We have such cool stuff here. We have the 5 rarest first drafts of the Constitution, the handwritten drafts of James Wilson, never displayed in the first place, even at the Constitutional Convention. And then the first public printing of the Constitution. So people read the Constitution in this newspaper called the Pennsylvania Packet, which was the only newspaper in town. And the first copy is upstairs, and that's where they read the Constitution. It was like the blog of its day, and it was a newspaper. And then in the 1920s, there were small pamphlets where people wrote the anti-war protests that led to those Espionage Act prosecutions. And then in the 1960s, it was the major networks. And really, unless you had access to ABC or CBS and these anchors who you guys may vaguely have heard of, like Walter Cronkite, who was still alive when I was young, and a few trusted authorities, then you wouldn't be able to reach the whole nation. And it's true that there were claims in the 1960s that there should be a fairness doctrine that would allow people who disagreed with the line of CBS onto the airwaves, and they were rejected properly, in my view, on libertarian free speech grounds that corporations should not be forced to exercise editorial judgments that they didn't make, and that the free press should have that discretion. So the position you take is maybe right, and maybe Facebook and Google are just like CBS, or just like the authors of the printing presses of the founding in the 1920s, and they can have their own editorial judgments. The problem is The argument on the other side is that Facebook and Google's freedom from liability for the speech posted on their platforms is premised on the idea that they're not newspapers, that they're not editors. The Communications Decency Act has an immunity for liability, Section 242, which says that the platforms are not allowed to make editorial decisions, and as a result, if I post something libelous on Facebook, the Facebook is not liable for it. That is responsible for a lot of the freedom that we have in America. Europe, which does impose liability on the platforms for illegal speech that's posted on them, in those countries, there's a lot less speech on those platforms. So I guess the counter to your excellent suggestion would be Facebook and Google can't have it both ways. They can't be not editors for liability purposes, but editors for the purpose of adopting their own hate speech policies. There's not an easy, and the other answer would be now the kind of gossip or even political activism that used to take place in real space or in town meetings that are quintessentially protected First Amendment spaces now take place online, so it's not really true that these are selective spaces that have specific identities. They're operate more like public fora and should be treated as such. Hard questions, but as are all questions in constitutional law, that's what makes it interesting. And you can argue the analogies round or flat, just do it thoughtfully and you will make a great contribution to public discourse. Wonderful.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here.
My question is, how do you incentivize the next generation of Americans to not only stay informed, but break away from their silos and echo chambers?
I have to ask you that because you have done it yourself, obviously, and you're devoting a huge amount of time and energy. Well, what do you think the answer is? You tell me.
To be honest,
I don't mean to be a neat. That's like a law professor's trick, but I'm genuinely curious. You're much closer to this.
to be honest with you, I kind of struggle with that because I think that with the developments of information technology, I think that nowadays everybody has an opinion, and the line that divides or splits opinions from facts, that's becoming more and more blurred. And what worries me is that I see a lot, not just only on social media, but if you go around, talk to my friends and my family, I'm hearing that legitimate news outlets and sources are being dismissed as fake, liberal, or conservative. And I can't tell if it's always been that way or if it's getting worse and worse.
I can, been around long enough to know that I think it is getting worse. And the filter bubble and echo chambers effects have been empirically quantified, and people are more and more just listening to stuff that reinforces their own pre-existing views, and that makes their views more extreme, and there's a vicious cycle. In the age of CBS and ABC, that Walter Cronkite time, those three outlets, that was where people got their news, and they had to be at least formally neutral, and it was harder to get really polarized. I mean, I don't have the answer to this hardest of all civic questions, but a couple thoughts. At the Constitution Center, I always tell people, try to separate your political views from your constitutional views. In other words, entertain the possibility that you might think that hate speech is a bad thing and should be suppressed, but the Constitution protects it, or you might think that hate speech is relatively harmless, but the Constitution allows it to be suppressed. And by telling people to set aside their policy or partisan views and educate themselves about the text and history of the Constitution, at least that changes the debate, because we all have a lot to learn about the Constitution. I teach this stuff, and I don't know about most of those 80 clauses in any sort of depth. So it just elevates the discussion above partisan politics. The second thing is I've been a journalist about the Supreme Court and law for a long time, and increasingly, I'm not interested in my own opinions. I am more interested in learning, frankly, and listening, not in some hypothetical sense, but because all the questions we're talking about are really hard, and the answers are not at all obvious, and we have to learn a lot of facts, and learn a lot of law, and think really creatively in order to have informed opinions about these hard questions. And the other thing is that I really believe that there are good arguments on both sides of most of these questions. And that's the beauty and privilege of the Constitution Center. We're required to bring together divergent points of view, liberals and conservatives, and just making people hear the arguments, giving people an opportunity to hear the arguments on both sides and then encouraging them to make up their own minds is an elevating exercise that it's hard to be a really fierce partisan when you see lots and lots of smart people disagreeing respectfully about these questions. So I guess all I'm saying is that if you can find opportunities for yourself, first of all, because we all have to let's just begin with ourselves. Let's discipline ourselves not to retreat into our own filter bubbles, to try to expose ourselves to the opposite point of view, to have enough humility and open-mindedness to recognize that people with whom we disagree deserve a fair hearing. Gosh, these campus debates would be a really tough but important opportunity. You may think that the folks on the other side are wrong constitutionally, but you can listen hard to what they're saying about dignity and equality. Those are very important arguments, the pain, the emotional distress and all that, rather than just dismissing it out of hand. And then just being a more empathetic, humble learner will make us better people, and then will make us better able to listen to others. And then, structurally try to create venues and opportunities to bring together different points of view. The Constitution Center is exciting. Some judges have told me for them, they're really inspired by juries. Juries are one place where citizens of different perspectives come together, and they're locked in a room, and they're forced to deliberate with each other and reconcile their views and try to come to some sort of common end. And judges say it usually works. Jury trials are atavisms now. Barely, a tiny percentage of trials go to jury, but they generally reach a good result. So just remembering that the structure of the deliberation, the way that the rules are set up, may affect whether people are able to get out of the filter bubbles, and basically getting us all off our darn iPhones, except for the interactive Constitution, and to reading other stuff is a personal cyber discipline that can maybe elevate civic discourse.
Hi. First off, thank you for the speech. I really enjoyed it. So something I've seen a lot recently online is just how someone will tweet something out that's considered offensive, and then it blows up, and then that person is subsequently fired from their job, like within the next couple of weeks. When it's not like I think for a government job that would be considered possibly like violating freedom of speech. But if it's a private company, or if like their boss like really disagrees with that or is offended by it, I guess my question is, how do you feel about that? If that's a freedom of speech restriction, or if that's freedom, or I think freedom of speech also comes with the freedom to have consequences from your speech.
Legally, it's a hard question that probably, where the First Amendment often does not protect the individual. So famous case from a few years ago, Stacy Snyder, teacher in training in Millersburg, Pennsylvania, posts MySpace, this was a long time ago, a picture of herself with a pirate hat with a plastic cup that said "Drunken Pirate." And her supervisor said she was promoting underage drinking, and they tried to fire her from teacher's college right before she graduated. And she said, you don't know it was in the cup, and it was perfectly legal, and I wasn't promoting underage drinking. And she sued under the First Amendment, and she lost because a judge said her speech did not relate to a matter of public concern. The odd First Amendment doctrine for public employees says that only speech on matters of public rather than private concern is protected. And since this was private, perversely, that meant she was out of luck from a First Amendment perspective. And she was fired, and she couldn't become a teacher as a result. So legally, the First Amendment may not protect you. Employers generally have broad discretion to fire you at will, as long as they're not discriminating on the basis of protected characteristics. Morally, I don't know. That's a tough case. I guess we may disagree about that. That seems harsh to me. And I guess I just gave this passionate argument against a right to be forgotten on the internet. I don't think that law should allow people to remove truthful but embarrassing facts about themselves. But I do think we need as a society to be more forgiving, to not taking people out of context, not allowing the worst thing about us to be the first thing that's remembered about us. One of the core definitions of privacy is the right not to be judged out of context on the basis of snippets of information that can be confused for genuine knowledge, and denouncing someone and reducing them to the one ill-made joke that they have made, or one tweet, is a brutalizing and a liberal instinct. There was a really good book, the excerpt in the New York Times Magazine, about that woman, Justine Sacco, who wrote the tweet on the plane that was taken out of context and viewed to be a racist tweet, and she was fired, and her career was destroyed. And it was one, there's an interesting SAT word called synecdoche, which means confusing the part for the whole. And that's what we do when we take the worst thing about someone, and it's the first thing that we come to view them as. So let's just all have a little more charity. Thank you. Oh. I think those applause may mean that I've almost delighted you long enough, so maybe one more question and then we'll.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I know, and I think everyone in here agrees, that education is the most important way and the best way to help people understand what their rights are and what other people's rights are. But my question is, we have an education system, K through 12, where I have to take a math class every year, but I didn't learn, I didn't take a formal civics class until my senior year, and I could go, if I'm a science major or if I'm not interested in this, I could go my entire college education without having to take another civics class that teaches me more about my rights. So how do we change that culture?
We bring this incredible new interactive constitution to every student in America from 8 to 80. I'm not kidding about this. This is my mission. I'm really devoting my life to this, and I think that we can do it. There are formal civics requirements in most public schools. They're linked to the old Common Core standards, which are now, you're not allowed to say Common Core, but most states have adopted some version of a civics requirement. But as you say, most schools just treat them in the most vacuous way and don't teach substantive history and constitutional education. We have a serious national initiative at hand to write lessons plans and teacher training manuals that will be distributed not only by the College Board for AP kids, but starting in 4th and 5th grades, posted online and make this accessible. And I hope we'll have it even more highly funded. And I really am an evangelist for this idea that starting really early, citizens have an opportunity to be really substantively educated. If you're interested in this piece of the Constitution Center mission, you've got a lot of important work to do defending free speech, but let me know. I can connect you to our education team. You can brainstorm with us about ways of bringing this amazing tool to folks, and also distribution tools on your campus. I guess this is my takeaway, obviously. Help spread the word about this. If you call us to organize debates, tell people about it, and give me ideas about how you can convince your friends to download the app and educate themselves about the Constitution, because it's so crucially important. I'm just going to end. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so impressed by your courage and your passion and your conviction. What you're doing is hugely important, and keep the faith. Thank you so much.